Hello, everyone. On behalf of all of us here at Providence, thank you for joining us here today for our first ever Doc Talk. Many of you have invested in this work and we're delighted you can be with us here today. My name is Diana Fisher and I'm honored to serve as Executive Director for the Providence Children's Health Foundation. Did you know that Providence is the #1 health system in Oregon caring for children? Providence also helps birth 1 in 5 babies in Oregon each year. And today we're going to hear and discuss the important role of brain development in children, which is vital for building healthy families and thus a strong community. And now I'd like to introduce our featured speaker today. Dr. Martine Sachs is Medical Director of Providence Children's Development Institute at Providence Child Center. She's a published developmental pediatrician and works to evaluate, counsel, and provide treatment for children, adolescents, and their families with a wide range of developmental and behavioral difficulties. She received her Bachelor of Science degree from Yale University in biology and her Doctor of Medicine at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. She came to Oregon to fulfill her residency and fellowship at Oregon Health Science University. And Dr. Sachs is dedicated to supporting patients and their family caregivers to find innovative solutions for children. So let's welcome Dr. Sachs.
Thanks, Diana. I appreciate that. Well, I'm excited to be here with everyone today. When I first said yes to this talk, I thought I would be in a room with 20 to 30 people. So it's a little daunting to have a lot of people online. I can't see any of you, but we'll go ahead and give it a go. So I'm going to be talking about how brain development in childhood affects us as adults. And just one little housekeeping to note, I am in the clinic today. You can see that I'm in a clinic. So there are kids here and they may be happy or not so happy to be here. So we may hear them in the background. There's also a daycare center with their playground right outside my window. So there may be noises. So I hope that's not too distracting for folks. Okay, so Providence Children's Development Institute. We've got 3 locations in the greater Portland area. We have physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech language pathologists, audiologists, dietitians, and psychologists, as well as developmental pediatricians and nurse practitioners. And we're all versed in the developmental needs of children. We're sort of your one-stop shopping site for development in the greater Portland area. And the reason we have all of these providers, all these different kinds of people working together, is because all aspects of development are interrelated. And you can't really master it if you don't look at all of them. So when we think about development, we think about the classic milestones, gross motor skills, sitting up and rolling over and walking, language, fine motor, cognitive skills. I think most people are aware of those, but there's also emotional development, and that's a really important part of all our development. So if our emotions don't develop, if we don't manage and master those, it sort of doesn't matter that we can do other things. All of the therapists and providers at PCDI use a neurodevelopmental approach with an awareness of all of these different aspects of development, and also how we can move kids forward, even if they have areas of their development that aren't working as well as we might like. I want to talk a little bit about emotional development. We all know that babies cry. They don't have a lot that they can tell us, and there's not a lot of needs that they have. And so when we think of babies, their real emotional development is on noticing emotions. Oh, I'm hungry, or I'm tired, or I'm hot. Children then, ages somewhere between 2 and 4, move to expressing emotions. And anyone who's been around a toddler knows that they express a lot of emotions. We call it the terrible twos for a reason. I think they're sort of terrific twos because that child's becoming more of an individual. But that's all about expressing emotion. And then the next stage is on managing your emotions. And at home, we may not see that children manage their emotions very well, but that goes through those preschool years and really goes on through adulthood to manage emotions. For this process to take place, this emotional development, there needs to be an environment to foster the development, and there needs to be brain maturity. Part of that brain maturity is just laying down what's called myelin, which is a fatty sheath around the long arms of the cells in the brain, and developing interconnections among the different brain cells. So that's sort of the basics. So childhood, unlike Las Vegas, what happens in childhood doesn't stay in childhood. We are sort of a compendium of who we were as children and what happened to us. So what do we take out of childhood? Well, there's genetic things that we take out of childhood. So your eye color is something that's pretty much just genetic. Maybe you've got a kickin' sense of style. This is me and my mom both wearing ponchos with fringe. So I learned from my mom. I'm looking up at her adoringly. Maybe you get athleticism or loyalty to your hometown team. There are New York teams on here because I'm from New York. So I was a Mets fan. My brother was a Yankees fan. And my dad was a Buffalo Bills fan. Maybe you get musical ability or a love of music or family recipes or a love of cooking or great math ability. So when we think about it, what makes us who we are? Well, there's a little bit of nature or nurture. That's been a question that's been around for a long time. And then there's also a question of genetics or environment. So when I was first learning, it was, is this nature, is this nurture? And then was it genetics or is it environment? And really what we know now is it's not or, it's an and. So one way to think about it is genetics builds the rocket, but environment launches it. So while we have nature and nurture, genetics and environment, and we hope that that brings everything together in a positive way, there are many children who carry a bigger burden out of their childhood, and that burden affects their health and well-being. And what we've learned is that there is a group of things that can happen to you in childhood that are called adverse childhood events or ACEs. And what happened was this work started over 20 years ago. There was an obesity clinic through a Kaiser program, and it was noted that 50% of the patients were dropping out. And interestingly enough, the patients who were dropping out were the ones who were successfully losing weight. And so to understand what was going on, the researchers interviewed patients and inadvertently found out that a tremendous percentage of these people in the obesity clinic had been sexually abused during childhood. And so they started to ask more and more questions about childhood and what happened to these children when they were younger. And what they found is that there was a link between childhood adversity and chronic disease, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, autoimmune disorder, suicide attempts, all sorts of things that we didn't really typically associate with having illness as cause of illness. And so these are the categories of things that could happen in children that were related to what would happen later on in life. Abuse, whether physical, emotional, or sexual, neglect, physical or emotional, and then a category called household dysfunction. And that would be about the people who are caring for you. Was there mental illness? Did someone get incarcerated? Is there substance abuse in the household? Was there divorce? Was a parent treated violently or abused? And even more stunning than seeing that these things that happened before you were 18 were the foundation for disease later in life is that there was what's called a dose response relationship. The higher the number of ACEs or adverse events you had, the higher the risk of disease you had in the future. And this next slide is just a list of the questions. I know it's really hard to see, but it gives you an idea. There's just 10 questions. And what you do is you would answer yes if any of these things happened to you in your childhood before you reached the age of 18. And what we found was, or what was found in all of these studies, is that of people who did this, 67% to 85% of people had at least one adverse childhood event. Holy tamales, that is a lot of people. And 9 of the 10 top causes of death in the United States pre-COVID were associated with ACEs. So the diseases that kill people were associated with having adverse childhood events. And again, this is pre-COVID. COVID is now the third leading cause of death in the United States. And so we're going to just sort of not look at those stats. And what was found is having 4 or more ACEs created a more significant risk. And here's a slide that shows all the things that have a high association with ACEs: chronic lung disease, depression, diabetes, suicide attempts, heart disease. Um, and so I'm going to show you a couple of slides that just shows this, again, this dose response relationship. So at the bottom, the numbers are the number of ACEs that you would have, and then this stair stepping up. So smoking as an adult, the more ACEs you have, the greater likelihood that you're going to smoke. Same thing with childhood experiences and alcoholism. If your ACEs score is 4 or more, there's a 16% chance that you will be an alcoholic. And this one shows risk factors for adult heart disease. And this has a tremendous response when you look at children who had 7 or more ACEs. They have 3 times the rate of heart disease. That is pretty overwhelming. So how do these events in one's childhood cause disease? Well, it's all about stress. We all experience stress as adults. Stress for us tends to be something that we might have every day a little bit. And for us, it's more about maybe emotional or psychological burdens that we have. In fact, we often talk about stress as a feeling. I'm feeling stressed. Um, but it really is both emotional and physical. So when I was in college, I had broke up with a boy and I was feeling absolutely miserable. And I had a very analytical friend who said, "Are you emotionally miserable or are you physically miserable?" And I said, "Yes," because it is all one big thing. So when we have stress, whether it's giving a talk like I'm doing now, or trying to run away from a lion that's trying to attack us, we have real physiological changes, right? So if you think about just a little stress, your heart starts to beat faster, your breathing comes faster, your palms maybe get sweaty. And then if it's a real physical threat, your body is going to do all these other amazing things. It's going to stop your thinking and have you focus just on getting the heck out of the stress or the threat. Your body will even mobilize fat and glucose, sugar from your body so that you have energy to run. And when you're going ahead and doing all of these things, that's all you're focused on. And theoretically, the stress will be over and you'll do what we call rest and digest. You'll be like, okay, I got this. Phew. But sometimes people have stress that's ongoing. Like, what if that lion was there every day? That turns into what we call toxic stress. And here's just a slide that talks about the degrees of stress. Positive stress, that's what I'm having now, a little brief increase in heart rate, a little intense focus, maybe a little elevation of stress hormones, but I'm good. This could happen when someone has to go to a doctor's visit, kid has to go get a shot, the first day of school. You get in it, you get out of it, you're over it. Tolerable stress is more serious, typically temporary, but something a little more dramatic, and it could be even quite dramatic, the loss of a family member or a serious illness. But you've got all these positive influences. You've got parents and friends and your peeps around you, and you also know how to take care of yourself. So that stress is tolerable. Toxic stress is sort of one up from that. It's intense, it's prolonged. You have this long acting stress response, and you don't have any positive influences or relationships. And I want to remind you that when we're talking about ACEs and what it does to you, we're talking about children. Children don't even know how to manage their emotions, right back to that emotional development slide. So, how are they really going to handle stress? And this is where we get into what happens in your brain. So your amygdala is this little tiny area. It looks like an almond in the middle of your brain. It's where you detect fear and threat. It's called the fight or flight center. And it's also where you store emotional memories, both positive and negative. So that tiny little area gets activated when you're upset. Okay. And then you have something called your prefrontal cortex, this whole area, and you've got a frontal cortex and prefrontal cortex, but we'll just talk about prefrontal. That doesn't develop fully until you're 25 years old. And that's why, just anecdotally, that's why you used to not be able to rent a car until you were 25 because you were felt not to have good prefrontal cortex. It's responsible for your planning, for your decision making, for self-control, for problem solving, managing your emotions. And Dr. Daniel Siegel did this great visual image of the brain. I'm going to ask for the next slide. And so the amygdala is like your thumb, this little internal area, and your prefrontal cortex is like your fingers over your thumb. So your prefrontal cortex keeps that amygdala in check. You're not going to always be fight or flight. When something happens that upsets you, you flip your lid and that your prefrontal cortex goes away. It's no longer in action, and your amygdala takes over. So if you're a child and you have ACEs and you're overwhelmed, you're going to use that amygdala a lot. And when you use something a lot, it gets big and burly. It's like a muscle that you're exercising. that doesn't give you the time or space to develop this prefrontal cortex to know how to manage your emotions. So that area is puny and you have this giant amygdala. So which part of your brain is going to show up when you're even a little stressed? Your amygdala. And you know what? People who use their amygdala are not fun to be around. They don't win friends. They don't influence people. They are. They're not well put together. So children who have experienced toxic stress and or who have high ACEs are delayed in their emotional development in part because that amygdala is pumping all the time and they can't override it. So their behavior is going to look inappropriate. It's going to look immature. Um, they really don't have the ability at that moment to act differently, even though we as adults around them really want them to. And it's really important to understand it's not volitional. It's not like they're choosing to do this. They don't have the way to override their emotional system. They are stuck in fight or flight mode. And the more they're stuck in that mode, the harder it is to get out. And so we have this sort of very depressing pyramid. So you have adverse childhood experiences, it disrupts your neurodevelopment, that causes social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. And then all sorts of other negative things happen, including disease and early death. That is depressing. But we're only halfway through the talk, so we're going to show what we can do to address ACEs and toxic stress. One of the keys is resilience. So here you are, you've got negative things happening over here, adverse events, lots of stress. We want to fill up the positive end, or your family wants to fill it up. Anyone wants to fill up your positive end. So that becomes where you can focus. The single most common factor for children who develop resilience is one stable, committed relationship with a parent, a caregiver, or an adult. One person. So the way to counteract ACEs is providing a nurturing, safe, and stable environment, helping children learn to cope with adversity, and reducing their exposure to more ACEs. Now, the early work that was done in ACEs was talking to adults who were looking back on their childhood and they already had all these disease issues and high stress situations. And then there was a shift to doing ACEs work testing parents. What were your ACEs when you were a child? So that the community could give support to those parents who had high ACEs and they could be better parents to their children. And now in phase 3, what we're mostly doing is looking at the ACEs that children are having, understanding those ACEs, and building in help for them. And what we noticed was that just telling someone, "Wow, you had a lot of adversity in your childhood, and that seems to be affecting you now," can actually help. So just like there's a dose response association, the more ACEs you have, the greater your risk for illness. There is a dose response relationship. The more positive experiences you have, the better your resilience, the more likely you are not to have all of these negatives, even if you have a high number of ACEs. So that is pretty awesome. How do you build resilience? Well, the examiners who went ahead and got all of the ACEs work also started to ask questions about resilience. And these are the kinds of things that we check in with families on about building resilience. If you were able to talk with someone about your feelings, if your family stood by you, if you felt supported in your community or by friends or in high school, if you had some adults in your world who protected you, that builds resilience. So this slide shows the 7 core aspects of resilience. Competence, so helping kids understand their skills and build their skills. Confidence, so that they feel good about that. Building a connection, building a sense of character and contribution. Coping and control. And what's really lovely about this is that the 5 of these that are in a different color, these are all things that developmental therapies address. Right? When children who have developmental delay come to our program, we are looking at, the therapists are looking at, whoever's working with them, where are their skills now and how am I going to build those skills? How am I going to improve their confidence? How am I going to help their family understand where that child is functioning? And how are we going to build in strategies for them? So PCDI really works often with children who have tremendous adversity and need extra help to move forward. Here are some other buffering resources that are really important to think about because not everyone has horrible over the top ACEs, but we all need extra support. So even if your family, your children, your nieces, your nephews, your friends' children haven't had real adverse ACEs that are dramatic, they still have some adversity in their lives and they still need to have some extra support. That can be in supportive relationships like we've talked about and things like mental health care, but also access to nature, quality sleep, balanced nutrition, physical activity, and mindfulness practices. So some schools have adopted mindfulness practices. So kids, when they're overwhelmed, can go to a mindfulness space. They may get some deep breathing moments. They're taught to relax their bodies. They might grab a snack, but what they really do is have a chance to calm themselves, to acknowledge that they need to step away before they come back to the classroom. Baltimore has done a lot of work with mindfulness in elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. And they even have guided meditation over the PA system. And what they found is that schools who adopted these mindfulness practices have fewer uh, detentions, fewer behavioral outbursts, and fewer suspensions. And Portland Public Schools has started a mindfulness program. They're working with a program called Peace in Schools. In fact, there often is, instead of detention now, if you had a rough day, you get a mindfulness afternoon. So we're really employing all of these things that we've learned in order to help families and children do better. What about COVID? Well, COVID is a pretty big stress. And like other stresses, everyone experiences it differently. So I'm a cat person, but here are two cute dogs. The one on the left, who looks a little bit like Wishbone to me. I think of that dog, those two dogs, they went into the same puddle, right? But that little dog, it came up to its neck. I think of that dog as having walked into COVID with 3 or 4 ACEs already. And boy, has that been a big effect on that dog. Whereas the lovely retriever maybe had 1 ACE and didn't get really affected. Another way to say this is we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. So I want to go back to this degrees of stress and talk about a couple of things here. So positive stress, I don't think anyone has positive stress from COVID. We all have minimally tolerable stress. But let's look at the difference between tolerable and toxic stress. So tolerable stress, serious but temporary, you've got your community around you. Toxic is prolonged and you don't have those supports. And what's happened in COVID? Well, we've lost our supports, right? We don't have those connections that build resiliency. If you're a child and your support was that teacher that you saw at school, or those kids that you saw at school, or maybe it was just going to band class, that doesn't quite happen. You're at home. You're not able to have those experiences. Maybe your family isn't present. Maybe as well, your family is experiencing some really tremendous issues with COVID. And so, what I would postulate is that pretty much yeah, about every child has had enough of an aversive event from COVID to add to their adversity. Now, interestingly, in the state of California, where they're now scanning every child for ACEs, they've added a little extra, which is related life events. And this includes other things that children might experience, maybe not in their household, but that adds to their stress. These events can also be adverse childhood experiences. So, being a victim of violence, which can be bullying, maybe being discriminated against, even for your learning differences or your disability, which is going to hit all the patients we see in PCDI, problems with housing, problems with food. And I would say we need to add COVID here. So, what we're going to see now is that more people are going to have more adverse childhood events and be at higher risk for disease later on due to the fact that we've all been through a pandemic. Again, pretty depressing. The patients that we see at CDI already have delays in their development or they're at risk for delays. And what we know about adversity is that it sort of pauses your neurodevelopmental pathway. So that means the patients that we're seeing already are vulnerable. Their brains are already um, more likely to be affected by what's happening in their world. And if we add ACEs to those children, they're going to have a more significant response. When we do therapies, we're working in the clinic, the therapists are working with families. And they are trying to build development and they're also going to be building resilience. But it's not only about what happens in the therapy visit, it's really about what the family can bring home as well. And one experience really stuck with me. We had been working with this child for a year. He had been born prematurely. He was in the neonatal intensive care unit, so he was already vulnerable, at risk for developmental delays. He had a significant feeding disorder, so he was fed almost exclusively through a gastrostomy tube, a tube that goes through his belly wall into his stomach. And he was coming in weekly with his very devoted parents, who were highly educated, middle class family, to work on feeding therapies. And after about 10 months, they said, we probably should have said this sooner, but we don't have a table at home. And we had been working on therapies about tables and meal experiences. And that was a startling moment for me and for the therapist. One, because I felt like I let that family down by not asking that question. And two, because it seems to me such a basic thing. Everyone needs a seat at the table. This is Shirley Chisholm. She was a representative from the state of New York. I'm from New York. And this was a woman who had tremendous resilience. If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring in a folding chair. But a lot of our families don't have that resilience. The parents of the children we see have their own ACEs. The parents have had enough struggles, and they don't necessarily have a way that they can bring uh, their children to the table. And so, in a very real way, next slide. The table is an important place for a family. Not only is that where a family meal takes place, which is a nurturing time, both physically and emotionally, but it can be a center for a family to come together. It's a place for homework and games. And just like the table, there are other things that we do with our families and children that bring us together with them in an emotional way to foster these relationships, to foster their development and foster their resilience. And one is simply reading. But in a pandemic, the school's closed. So your child isn't coming home every week with a library book. The libraries are closed. You can put a book on hold, but you got to know what that book is. Um, you can't even really go to a bookstore, or you have to have the money and know what book you want to have. As just an aside, Multnomah County Library will make a pack of books for you. If you say, I have a 5-year-old who likes tugboats, they'll make books. But tables, books, and art supplies, art things, next slide, are really relatively simple, low-cost interventions that can foster resiliency in children, add to their confidence and their competence, help their parents feel like they're helping their children as well. And these things can break the cycle of toxic stress that affects that child's neurodevelopment and their health for the rest of their lives. So our goal is to help families get a seat at the table. At Providence, when we start meetings, we often begin with a reflection, and it's a great way to sort of be present at that meeting moment, sort of put your head where it needs to be. And I decided I wanted to end this talk with a reflection. And I have to let you know that sometimes I cry when I read this. So I want to apologize in advance. This is from the Talmud, so a Jewish text. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And so while there are many ways that we can, in our community, help families, we hope that some of you may be called to help the community of families served at Providence Children's Development Institute. We would love to give these families simple tools that they can use at home to build their own resiliency, to give them their own seat at the table. And so the foundation has just so graciously created an enrichment fund to help families get art supplies, books, maybe even tables, access to developmental summer therapy camp in our program to help end the toxic stress that families and children feel and to foster their neurodevelopment. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk with you all today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sachs. That was amazing. I learned so much just for myself and as a mother and a parent. It was so helpful. We got a few questions, and I thought since we have time, if you wouldn't mind answering a couple, that would be great.
Absolutely.
So one question that Robin asked was, has the ACEs evaluation been translated into other languages?
So it's definitely available in Spanish. The nice thing about ACEs is it's not owned by anyone, so anyone can go to the internet and download the questions. So it's definitely available in Spanish. In different communities, they have translated it into other languages, but it's absolutely easily available in Spanish.
Okay, that's great. One other question that came in that I thought of is, you were talking about when you share with families or with children, um, when you do the evaluation with ACEs, hey, looks like you have 2 or 3 of these things. And sometimes even that is like alleviating of their stress.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Is that about like helping with feelings of shame about their behavior or something like that?
So, and I just want to let you know, we're not actually doing ACEs in our clinic, so
Yeah.
we're not having that conversation. But what they found out was, especially for adults who had high ACEs and have illness, helping them understand that their disease process is related to something that happened to them when they were younger, helps them one realize, oh, okay. Wow, that was bad that happened to me, and it's not all my fault. I think one of the things, shame is sort of interesting, but also one of the things that's really difficult is, um, if you feel like you've done something to cause your disease process, it feels pretty awful, and you're not sure how you're going to get yourself out of it. And if someone says, you know, these things happened to you when you were younger, and that set your body up to have all these other problems, so what we're going to do is give you some support and help you think about that. That allows that person to feel better about themselves, to not feel like they've brought this on themselves. And it allows them to start to really investigate and to move forward. It actually showed that even having that conversation had fewer emergency room visits. Maybe it makes people feel like this isn't going to get worse. Maybe it feels like I can get some control over this. But always understanding more helps people. And for families to understand, for parents who struggle, because parenting is hard, right? We've all had bad
Mhm.
days as parents. For understanding that, oh, I can learn something about being a better parent from this, it helps people to move forward.
Great. I'm just monitoring the chat here. So uh, does Oregon DHS use the principles or have resources for long-term foster parents to help children? Do you know if there's resources there?
I can't speak specifically, but I will say that the ACEs work has been around for a while, and this concept of doing ACEs with children to understand their risk and to help people understand how that affects children is part of the training that foster parents get. Um,
Okay.
and so I don't know what are the additional resources. Um,
Mhm.
I would say in general, um, I'm going to just do my little aside, and I'm sorry, mental health services are under-resourced in almost any community. Portland is no different.
Yeah.
Again, resources to help a foster family understand that, to help children understand why they're flipping their lid. I think actually the biggest thing is to help a child understand you are not a bad kid. We're going to help you learn how to develop your emotional control better is a great way to go. So if we can do one thing, it would be, can we teach children that they're not being bad, that we
Mhm.
need to help them with their development? I think that would be absolutely awesome.
Yeah. One other question here. Susan asked, do you think the issues children developed from social isolation during COVID will resolve when things are, quotes, back to normal, or will it be long lasting?
Well, I think that I think there's two parts to that. So I think if a family had a lot of adversity during COVID, and especially if that family had other adversity, I think
Mhm.
those are going to be more longer lasting effects for those children. I think, and I sadly, I have this conversation with families every day. Every day I'm seeing families with children. Their children have been home, they haven't gone to school, they haven't seen their friends, they haven't been in some of their therapies. Um, I think it's going to take time for everyone to adapt. And what's also happened is we have taught people that they have to be scared. and they have to be careful not to get COVID. And what we're finding is children aren't able to turn around on a dime. So we spent the last 12 months telling them, don't go out, you can't go out, no, we can't, no, we can't, no, we can't. You have to at least try to have as many times as you say, hey, we gotten vaccines, mom and dad have a vaccine, it's going to be okay, it's better, it's better, it's better. So I think one of the things we have to realize is that children will not change that quickly. Yes, they are resilient, but if we spent an entire year telling them that they can't do something, that's a problem. My daughter watched Guys and Dolls when she was younger, and betting was illegal. Betting is illegal, and they bet on the horses. And I took her to the Oregon State Fair, and you can bet on the horse race, and she wouldn't do it because she thought we were going to get arrested. So some things get really seeded in kids' brains and are hard to move. This will seed in kids' brains. And so we, as adults, have to help them understand what's safe and how to get them out of that hyper-focused fear threat mode.
Right. Well, thank you. That was excellent. And we know there's some more questions coming in that we will answer. We'll get back to you by email. These slides and this recording will be available on our website. So you can go back and review those slides. People were asking about that. So again, we just want to thank Dr. Sachs. You were amazing. And if any of you that were listening today were inspired and want to learn more about how to help or get involved, please feel free to reach out to our team. Our contact information is on the screen, and we'll be following up with an email in the coming weeks. We're just so glad that you made time to come today. We really appreciate it. Our next Doc Talk is Tuesday, May 11, and it will feature the Providence Heart Institute. So we will hope that you will join us again for that wonderful event. Thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon.